read the intensification of the violence over the weekend. Do you think this is going to prove to be a pivotal turning point in the war in terms of Israel's ability to engage in further attacks on Rafah?
Sadly not, because I think there continues to be an overwhelming international unwillingness to impose real costs on Israel to change its behavior. The ICJ ruling has ordered, or the ICJ has ordered provisional measures that essentially require Israel to stop its military operations in the Rafah part of Gaza. The UN Security Council had approved a resolution, 2728, again urging Israel and requiring Israel to work in earnest towards a ceasefire. And yet Israel continues to violate all of these orders and all of these resolutions with significant impunity. So the European measures the measures by some European countries, Spain, Norway, and others, to unilaterally recognize Palestine as a state are symbolically significant because they represent a change in long-standing European position on the issue, but they do very little to impose real costs on the ground. And I think the US has continued, obviously, to shield Israel from broader criticism or real action to impose consequences and get it to change its behavior.
Yeah. Hasan, I want to put to you something that my colleague Stuart mentioned, and that was the fact that it's all very fine and well for these leaders of the West to put up tweets expressing their condemnation, their outrages at what has happened. But at the end of the day, it's still the U.S. that have leverage with Israel. And one way that they can exercise that leverage is by pausing shipments of military aid. Do you see that happening?
Well, that's right, in the sense that the U.S. has the greatest amount of leverage over Israel. It's absolutely critical to Israel's warfighting effort. It provides a lot of financial and political support to Israel. It vetoes UN Security Council resolutions taking aim at Israel. And so most definitely the United States has the greatest amount of leverage that it can use to compel Israel to change its course of action in the Gaza Strip and to show greater respect for international law. But clearly there isn't the political willingness to do so. However, that doesn't mean that Europe is out of options. There are a number, a dizzying amount of European sanctions on countries like Russia, countries like Iran. And so there is a broader toolkit that can be used to bring more pressure to bear in Israel. And clearly, I think all efforts to reason with the current Israeli government have very obviously failed by the recognition, including of senior European officials like Joseph Borrell. And so I think it's there nevertheless is a lot of room in in Europe's toolkit that it can use. And so I think, yes, the US is obviously the most important partner, but I don't think Europe has exhausted all its options in trying to change Israel's behavior.
So, Hasan, this war has been going on for almost 8 months now, and originally the Israeli forces had two stated aims. One of them was to bring back hostages, the other one was to neutralize Hamas. And we know around 112 hostages have been returned out of 240 expected, but Hamas are still, by and large, very present. Yes, some senior leaders have been killed throughout the course of these attacks, but many of them are still present. They have not been neutralized. Bigger picture question, how does Hamas get neutralized?
Well, I don't think that's necessarily an achievable aim. It's, I think, clear that Hamas has so far been quite successful at denying Israel the strategic victory in Gaza that it seeks. Its leaders, by and large, especially the most senior echelon, is still very much intact. Hamas continues to resurface in areas that had previously been cleared by the Israeli military. It continues to be able to mount complex operations using drones and other equipment. And I think very significantly from the political, psychological perspective, it continues to be able to launch rockets deep into Israeli territory, including a few days ago, rockets reaching the Israeli capital, Tel Aviv. And so I think that sends a clear message that Hamas is here to stay, that it's going to be very difficult for Israel to totally eradicate Hamas. And I think the world no longer accepts or is increasingly, I think, unwilling to accept the Israeli premise that anything goes and at any cost, Israel will try and annihilate Hamas, no matter the humanitarian fallout and no matter the consequences to Palestinian civilians. The point I think that's also worth mentioning here is that because of Hamas's resilience, it's becoming, I think, increasingly obvious that the two objectives you referred to, annihilating Hamas and liberating the hostages, cannot be achieved simultaneously. Israel will have to choose whether it is serious about liberating the hostages, which I think the Netanyahu government so far has shown it is not, or if it wants to continue to pursue what I think is an ultimately unachievable objective of totally eradicating Hamas. Because Hamas has shown a lot of resilience, it's shown its ability to resurface and to continue launching attacks into Israel.
Hasan, I don't want to let you go before asking about Iran. There was a report, I'm not sure if you've seen it overnight, but very significant. According to this report that was seen by Bloomberg, IAEA inspectors say that Tehran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium rose 17% over the last 3 months, which means that should they want to use it for economic warfare, they probably do now have the capability of doing so. How threatening is that to the rest of the region, especially in light of the latest Iranian developments, the upcoming presidential elections? How closely should the international community also be watching what's happening in Iran right now?
Well, quite closely, but I don't think it's surprising that Iran feels the need to stockpile uranium at the moment. Iran has been flaunting, I think, its rules of engagement with the IAEA, has been rather uncooperative of late. But I think that reflects Iran's own concern and its own threat perception vis-a-vis Israel. So let's not forget that Iran has been engaged in a shadow war for Israel. And then quite recently, in the context of the ongoing war in Gaza, that shadow war has boiled over into the surface and has materialized into a round of direct strikes at one another. So I think the stockpiling of uranium on the part of Iran is intended to signal that Iran feels threatened and is willing to take very serious measures to ensure and guarantee its security. I think there are American efforts to engage in indirect talks with Iran via Oman. We know that 2 rounds of talks have taken place, one in January and one earlier in May. So there is a U.S. effort to try and contain this and to try and de-escalate the situation. But I think the notion that Iran is stockpiling uranium is, I think, very much intended to send a signal on the part of Iran, and I think reflects the increase in tensions and threat that is, I think, characteristic of the current situation in which the region is in because of this ongoing war in Gaza.